This morning, we're going to continue our series called Dysfunctional. And our text for today comes from Genesis chapter 31, and it is, in fact, the whole chapter. Genesis chapter 31. And this chapter of Genesis, it's really a convoluted story of the dysfunction in Jacob's life and the lives of those around him. It's pretty crazy. It's a story of drama with the in-laws. It's a story of deception and thievery, all kinds of immoral decisions, a story of idolatry. There's even some false gods that are getting worshiped in here. And there's even a weird line about menstrual cycles. Yep, teenagers, you got permission to laugh if you need to. It's pretty interesting. And what we're going to see from Genesis chapter 31 is that the only way our dysfunction is truly dealt with is through Jesus. It's the only way our dysfunction can truly be dealt with. Genesis 31, starting in verse 1. Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, "Jacob's taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and back to your relatives, and I will be with you." So Jacob has all these good reasons to leave his father-in-law Laban. He's been working for his father-in-law Laban, and now God is giving him all these good reasons to leave, to get out of town, to get out of his father-in-law's house. But he knows that he needs to have his family on board in order to do this. So Jacob goes to his two wives, Rachel and Leah. Yep, sister wives, it's in the Bible, check it out. A couple sermons ago we talked about it. He takes his two wives and takes them out into the field where Laban, their father, can't overhear this conversation. And Jacob explains to his two wives that Laban is not the one who's been looking out for them, but God has. Laban has not been taking care of them, but God has. And because of that, they need to leave. In fact, Jacob, he goes as far as saying that God had given him a dream about the speckled sheep and the speckled goats and the striped goats and spotted sheep and spotted goats. Thought we left animal husbandry in last week's text? Nope. Followed us into this one. Still talking about it. So Jacob has this dream from God with all the sheep and all the goats. And what does God say in the dream? Once again, God repeats himself and he says, "Jacob, it is time for you to leave. Jacob, it is time to go." So he tells his wives all of this, and his wives, they are in fact on board. Verse 14, then Rachel and Leah replied, "Do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. Surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and to our children. So do whatever God has told you." Do whatever God has told you. In those verses, we find out Rachel and Leah, they're on the same page, because in ancient times, when a groom would marry a bride, he would provide the bride's family with what was known as the bride price. It was sort of like an ancient form of insurance. If anything were to happen to the groom, the bride's family would still have the bride price, that chunk of money that they could use to support the bride, they could use to support their daughter, because her husband could no longer support her. Ancient form of insurance, and as we know, Jacob, he didn't have that. When he comes to Laban a few weeks ago, we saw that Jacob, he's poor, he's destitute, he has nothing to his name, which is why he has to work those 14 years in order to earn both Rachel and Leah as his wives. And theoretically, what would have happened over the 14 years that he worked is that Laban would have accrued livestock and land and wealth and resources from all of Jacob's hard work. But what we find is that all of the earnings that Jacob would have gotten for Laban has squandered them, that he has wasted them away. And now the daughters, they have no inheritance of their father's household. They have good reasons to leave. It's kind of like a dysfunctional dad who would take their kids' college 529 plan and go down to the Come and Go and buy cigarettes and scratchers instead of paying for college. That's what's happening with Laban. That's the kind of dysfunction that we see in the life of Laban. So they're on board. Rachel and Leah, they're in. And that is exactly what Jacob and Rachel and Leah do. They leave. Verse 17, then Jacob put his children and his wives on camels. He drove all his livestock ahead of him, along with the goods he accumulated in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. And when Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. We're going to get to those in just a minute. We're going to talk about them a whole bunch. Verse 20, moreover, Jacob deceived Laban, the Aramean, by not telling him he was running away. So he fled with all he had, and crossing the river, he headed for the hill country of Gilead. As you can imagine, because of Laban and his dysfunction, Jacob and Rachel, they end up leaving quite dysfunctionally. Stealing away in the middle of the night, stealing some of Laban's possessions. They leave dysfunctionally. And finally, in verse 23, Laban finds out that they have in fact left. Verse 22 rather. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. Taking his relatives with him, he pursued Jacob for 7 days. He caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. And then God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream and said, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Now, Bible scholars have a couple different theories about why God might show up and say, hey, don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Maybe when Laban is speaking to Jacob, or maybe when God is preventing Laban from speaking to Jacob, it's because God knows that even if Laban tries to help Jacob, even if Laban lets Jacob leave, that it's going to cause more problems for Jacob. That Laban is so dysfunctional that no matter what he touches is going to cause problems for Jacob and for God's plans. It's almost as if God is removing Laban from this equation entirely. So then what happens is Laban is catching up with Jacob, and as he does, he confronts him. He confronts him and he calls him out. He comes in with all these accusations. He comes in guns blazing. Laban is ready for a fight. He says, why did you steal my daughters? Why did you take my granddaughters away from me? Why did you take them off like they were prisoners of war? How could you do something? How could you deprive me of giving them a proper farewell? I would have thrown a party. There would have been music. There would have been a feast. How could you do this to me? And then in verses 29 through 30, we get to Laban's real concern. This is where we see his dysfunction really showing through. Verse 29, I have the power to harm you. But last night, the God of your father told me, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. God said, hey, don't say anything to Jacob. What's the first thing Laban does when he sees him? He says something to Jacob. Opposite of what God said. Verse 30, now you've gone off because you long to return to your father's house, but why did you steal my gods? Those pesky household gods that keep showing up. Why did you steal my gods? You see that maybe Laban was more concerned with these household gods than he was even the lives of his kids and his grandkids. I think this is why Laban is really chasing Jacob down. Fun Bible fan fiction. Maybe Laban would have even chased him if the household gods wouldn't have gone missing. Maybe he would have been totally fine with Jacob running away with his kids and his grandkids. Not sure, that's Bible fan fiction, but what happens next is Jacob knows he hasn't done anything wrong. We know that Rachel's stolen the gods, but Jacob knows that he hasn't done anything wrong. So he says, Laban, go ahead, man. I'm innocent. Search my tent. Search the wives' tents. Do what you will. And he's so confident that he's done nothing wrong, that nobody has stolen anything. He says, hey, if you find that somebody has stolen something, put him to death. And then Jacob, unknowingly, has now put the wife that he loves under a death sentence. That's exactly what Laban does. He goes and he ransacks all of his kids' stuff. He goes through the maidservant's tents. He goes through Leah's tents. He goes through Jacob's tents. And finally, then he gets to Rachel's tent. And Rachel, we find Rachel, she's crafty and sneaky and devious. Rachel, she has taken these household gods and she has stashed them away in the saddle that she would have used to ride a camel, probably in the saddlebags. And Rachel is now sitting on top of that saddle. And Laban comes to her, verse 35, Rachel said to her father, don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period. Permission to laugh, especially teenagers. So he searched but could not find the household gods. Man, this puts a stop to Laban real quick. Man, you want to stop him in his tracks. The tone of this conversation, it must have shifted on a dime. Laban's like, oh, I'm so sorry, honey. Do you need the Tylenol or the heating pad? Is there anything I can do to help? That's what this just turned into. He comes in with accusations, and then it turns into an apology. It stops Laban in his tracks. I mean, what dad wants to talk with their daughter about their menstrual cycle? I'm so thankful that I've got 13 years. We just had a newborn daughter. Got 13 years before I got to worry about that conversation. 13 years of glorious peace before I have to figure out how to navigate that dysfunction, right? Now, in the next few verses, Rachel, she lies to her father. She comes up with this ruse or this story. In the next few verses, it looks like Jacob is innocent. The household gods cannot be found. And Jacob, because he knows that he's innocent, because he knows that he's done nothing wrong, he takes Laban to task. Jacob comes out guns blazing. Verse 36, Jacob was angry And he took Laban to task. What's my crime? He asked Laban. What sin have I committed that you hunt me down? Now you search for my goods. What have you found that belongs to your house? Put it here in front of you. Your relatives and mine, let them judge between us. You can hear the sarcasm dripping from Jacob's voice. What have you found, Laban? What have you found? You know what you found, Laban? You found a giant sack of nothing. Put it right here before us. You can feel the sarcasm in Jacob's voice because he knows that he hasn't done anything wrong. He knows that this dysfunction is not at his hands. And then Jacob goes on for the next 5 or 6 verses to very passionately defend himself, to prove his innocence to his father-in-law Laban. He says, Laban, I worked for you for 20 years. And in that 20 years, none of your sheep or your goats miscarried. I took care of the sheep so well that when a wild animal attacked them, I paid for the loss to the herd. I never even ate one of your sheep or your goats. You were blessed because of me. I worked 14 years for your daughters, 6 for your flocks. And what'd you do? You changed my wages 10 times. He sounds kind of like a disgruntled employee, right? This is like an HR conversation between Laban and Jacob. And then finally, he doesn't just defend himself. Verse 42, he recognizes that God is the one who has been defending him. Verse 42, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you surely would have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship, and he's seen the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you. At this point, Laban, I think he knows that he's been beat, but he can't quite admit that he's wrong. He sounds a little bit like a toddler in these next few verses. He sounds a little bit delusional. He says, everything's mine, 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 and you are wrong, Jacob. But in fact, Laban is the one who is in the wrong because God has in fact given the livestock and the land and the children and the grandchildren to Jacob. They do belong to Jacob. Verse 43, Laban answered Jacob, the women are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine, mine, mine. Yet what can I do today about these daughters of mine or about the children they've borne? Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us. Laban, I think that he knows he's been beaten, but he can't admit he's wrong. He knows he's been beaten because he's not going to take anything from Jacob. He's not going to get anything from this confrontation. So instead, because he can't beat Jacob, he's going to ensure that Jacob cannot beat him. They decide to set up this treaty that sort of sets up a dividing line between Jacob's people and Laban's people, a line that they're not going to cross, a border, if you will, that they are not going to cross. We see the legal agreement between them in verses 45 through 55. Jacob took a stone and he set it up as a pillar. He said to his relatives, probably Laban's men, gather up some stones. They took stones and they piled them up in a heap, and then they ate there by the heap, and Laban called it Yegar Sahadutha, and Jacob called the place Gilead. So we've got 2 different structures. We've got 2 different names. And then what happens next is Laban, I think he knows he's been beat, so he tries to save face. He tries to make himself look like the hero, make himself look like he is taking the moral high ground. He says, by the way, Jacob, you need to make sure that you treat my daughters right. Hasn't cared about them up until this point. By the way, Jacob, make sure that you don't marry any other wives other than my daughters. Hasn't cared about them up to this point. He's trying to take the high road, which Laban knows nothing about. But then in verses 53, I believe, or 51 through 55, we see what Laban was really the most concerned about. Verse 51, Laban said to Jacob, here's the heap and here's the pillar. The heap's a witness and the pillar's a witness. I'm not going to go past this heap into your land to harm you, and you're not going to go past this heap into my land to harm me. What does Laban care the most about? He cares about his property and his possessions. Not about his kids or his grandkids or their welfare. He cares about his stuff and himself more than anything else. You want to talk about dysfunction? Laban is the perfect picture of dysfunction. And then we see it even more clearly in verse 53. Laban, he swears by a bunch of gods. May the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of his father see this promise or this agreement or this covenant between us. Swears by all these different gods. He's covering his polytheistic basis. Wants to make sure all the gods hear him, right? But then compare that with Jacob. Compare that with Jacob. At the end of verse 53, Jacob took an oath in the name of his father, in the name of the fear of his father, Isaac. What did Isaac fear? Who did Isaac fear? He feared the one true God. Isaac feared the one true God. So when Jacob takes an oath in the name of the fear of his father, Isaac, he's taking an oath in the name of the one true God. So we've got 2 different structures, 2 different names, 2 different sets of gods that have been sworn to or prayed to. And what we see at the conclusion of these verses, is that though Jacob and Laban have come together, they have never been more separate. Though they come together, what they are agreeing to is to be completely and utterly and totally separated. That's what happens the next morning. Verse 55, early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and he blessed them, and then he left, and he returned home. Fun fact, he never meets with Jacob after this point again. Talk about dysfunction, right? Do you want to talk about dysfunction? Laban, he is dysfunctional. And with all the in-law drama that's taking place in these verses, we can all probably relate a little bit, because even if you've got a great relationship with your in-laws, there's still got to be a little bit of dysfunction there, right? I know that I can relate a little bit. I've got the greatest father-in-law that a guy could ask for, Mark McBain, best father-in-law that I could possibly have, but I've still got a couple of doozies of father-in-law stories. For example, one time when I was out of town, my father-in-law, he decided that what our house needed while we were gone and not able to have any input in the decision was a brand new used toilet. Yeah, great idea, right? So when we bought our house, the tank the cover for the tank on the toilet had a little chip in it. So my father-in-law brought his handyman over, and their solution was a new used toilet. They went to my wife's grandmother's house, and they took her toilet and installed that toilet in our house. My two favorite parts of this story. It wasn't like a regular sized toilet. It was like an extra small toilet, like a short, narrow toilet. So you don't have a lot of room to do your business on this stool. Second part that I love about this story is that that toilet, it sat like a full 1.5 inches off the ground. When they mounted it to the flange, I don't know what they did, but they didn't do it right, because there was an 1.5 inch gap all the way around the base of the toilet. And what did they do? How did they solve that problem? They filled it with silicone caulking. Yeah, it looked so sharp, man. It was clean. It was professional. Man, I wish I had a picture I could show. I don't, because I replaced the toilet myself and I did it right. But another time when we were out of town, there's more. Another time when we were out of town, my father-in-law very generously came over, and he was cleaning up our yard for us. And he did the mowing and the weed eating, and he weeded out our flower beds, and he also cleaned up some of the excess cables on the outside of our house. Yeah, you heard that right. He cut a bunch of cables off the outside of our house. Number one, no big deal. First cable that he cut, number one, no big deal. It was the old landline. Cut the old landline. Whatever, we don't use landlines because we're modern individuals. Number two, he in fact cut our internet line. So I get back from vacation, no Wi-Fi, welcome home. No Wi-Fi, this is great. I call the cable guy, he shows up and he says, dude, what did you do to your cable line? I said, what do you mean, sir? He says, somebody came and cut your cable line where it comes into the house. I was blown away, baffled, completely flabbergasted, did a little bit of detective work, found out that my father-in-law, he was responsible for that decision. Now, before you get the wrong picture, well, first of all, I probably need to stop going out of town, right? But second of all, before you get the wrong picture of what my father-in-law is like, when he found out that he made any of those mistakes, he paid very quickly to make sure that they got fixed the right way. And also my father-in-law and I, we just so happened to share a birthday together, May 10th. We were both born on May 10th. And every year on my birthday, what we do is we go to Lambert's together because they have a $10 off birthday deal. You're welcome. That is a gift to you. On your birthday, go to Lambert's, catch a roll. And every year we'll go to Lambert's. It's kind of like our tradition. And every year I'm reminded I've got the greatest father-in-law that a guy could ask for. But even if we've got great relationships with our in-laws, we probably know a little bit about dysfunction still. Maybe it's not our in-laws. Maybe it's our spouse. Maybe it's our kids. Maybe it's our grandkids. Maybe they're dysfunctional. Maybe it's our coworkers or our boss. Maybe they're dysfunctional. Maybe we can pinpoint some dysfunction in our lives. I'd be willing to bet that we can, because maybe we're like Jacob and we've experienced dysfunction due to someone else's jealousy, right? Laban's sons, they're jealous of Jacob. Maybe we're like Jacob and we've experienced dysfunction due to somebody else's greed. Jacob, he experiences dysfunction because of Laban's greed. Maybe we're not so much like Jacob, but maybe we're more like Rachel, and maybe we have caused some dysfunction, right? Maybe we're not on the receiving end of dysfunction, but on the dealing end. Maybe we have caused some dysfunction in the lives of other people. Like Rachel, she makes these immoral decisions, some thievery, theft, deception, secrecy, and then those decisions come back to haunt her, right? Come back to kind of bite her. Maybe we're more like Rachel. Or maybe we're like Laban and we find our life is so dysfunctional and so far removed from what we thought it was going to look like, we don't even recognize who we've become. We're doing things that we never thought we would do, like threatening to harm our family and chasing them down and making these crazy accusations. Maybe we're like Laban and we're dishonest, we can't be trusted, and we've been a bad manager or a bad boss, changed wages, been immoral or unethical. Maybe we have caused dysfunction for someone else. No matter where we stand, I believe that the text of Genesis chapter 31, it reminds us that we have experienced dysfunction and we have also caused dysfunction. We've experienced dysfunction, we've also caused dysfunction, but most of all, what Genesis chapter 31 reminds us is that when God intervenes, dysfunction is dealt with permanently. That when Jesus shows up on the scene, that is when dysfunction is truly and permanently, completely dealt with. But I also believe that Genesis 31, it gives us some ideas for what we can do in the meantime. What do we do in the meantime between when we are dealing with dysfunction and when dysfunction has been dealt with? What do we do with that space in between? Well, I think Genesis 31, it gives us some ideas about what dysfunction looks like, how dysfunction works, and maybe how we can avoid it right here and right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a second look at these verses. Don't worry, not all 55 of them. Very quickly, a second look at these verses. And what we're going to find is that God, he deals with our dysfunction, but there's also some stuff that we can do to deal with it here and now. We'll start in verses 1 through 3. Genesis 31, verses 1 through 3. If you remember this first scene in the story, we get dysfunction right out of the gate. Dysfunction right out of the gate because Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob's taken everything our father owned. He's gained all this growth. And Jacob also noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. And then God said to Jacob, you need to go back to the land of your fathers. You need to go back to the land that I promised to give to you. What we see in these first few verses is maybe a good idea for dealing with dysfunction is to create some distance between ourselves and those dysfunctional people in our lives. That's what Jacob and Rachel and Leah do here. They create some distance between themselves and Laban, the real root cause and source of all of their dysfunction. They distance themselves from the dysfunctional people in their lives. They leave because of the jealousy of Laban's sons. Every time Jacob's flocks and herds increase, it's more reason for Laban's sons to be jealous. Laban, you've got Laban's greed, right? He doesn't want to let Jacob go. He wants Jacob to stay because he knows that he's going to be blessed if he's close to Jacob. He doesn't want Jacob to leave. It's a good reason for Jacob to go. He's being taken advantage of. And finally, the best reason for Jacob to leave is very simply because God told him to do so. Direct command from God. In the dream and also in this audible voice, Jacob hears from God and God says, you need to leave, to distance yourself from dysfunctional people. So maybe that's what it looks like for us. Maybe dealing with dysfunction here and now before it's dealt with in eternity, maybe what we need to do is we need to create some distance between ourselves and the dysfunctional people in our lives. And it might look a lot like it looked for Jacob. It's probably going to take some hard work. I don't think driving flocks and herds and wives and women and children across the Euphrates River was easy. It might take getting really far away, creating serious and lasting space between us and the dysfunctional people in our lives. Jacob goes from Haran, where he's at now, back to Canaan. That's a 500-mile journey. Maybe we need 500 miles of separation between us and the dysfunctional people in our lives. Maybe what we need to do is we need to remember that it's not our responsibility to fix the dysfunction in others' lives. Jacob could have made all kinds of excuses for why he needed to stay. His daughters could have made all kinds of excuses for why they needed to stay and help dad get things sorted out, to help dad see things more clearly, to help dad understand what God was doing, but they don't. They don't because they knew, Jacob and Rachel and Leah, I think they knew, or they maybe were figuring out that God is the one who deals with our dysfunction. So maybe we need to distance ourselves from dysfunctional people. In the next couple verses, in the next scene in our story, verses 19 through 21, we see not only why Jacob and Rachel and Leah had to leave, but we also see how they left. And like we said, they don't exactly leave functionally. They leave kind of the wrong way, maybe the worst way possible. They leave dysfunctionally. Verse 19 through verse 21, Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel, she stole her father's household gods, and moreover, Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he was running away. So he fled with all that he had, and he crossed the river, and he headed for the hill country of Gilead. The second set of verses, I think maybe a good way for us to avoid dysfunction, or a good way for us to deal with dysfunction, would be very simply, this is like crazy practical, very simply to not do what dysfunctional people do. If we want to avoid dysfunction, don't do the stuff that dysfunctional people are doing. When Laban cheats and steals and lies to Jacob and to Rachel, how did Jacob and Rachel respond? They cheat and they steal and they lie to Laban. They do what dysfunctional people had done to them. And I think Rachel's dysfunction is pretty obvious. Jacob's maybe a little more nuanced, but Rachel's like right on the nose, right? She stole her father's household gods. Pretty dysfunctional, stealing from your dad. But Bible scholars, there's literally all kinds of research about what these household gods might have been. A couple options from the Tyndale Old Testament commentary from Andrew Steinman. One option is that these household gods, maybe they would have indicated who the heir for the family was going to be. It's one option, and that makes sense. Rachel was sort of stealing back her inheritance. Another option is that these household gods, they might have actually been idols or false gods that were worshipped in the belief they would provide protection or provision for Laban and his family. So maybe Rachel is stealing them to take provision and protection from her father, or maybe she's stealing them to gain provision and protection for herself. Maybe she trusts that these household gods really are gods. Or maybe, very simply, they're just worth a lot of money, made out of precious metals or expensive stones. That's another option. And maybe she's stealing them because she wants to take everything that her dad values. Take what's most important to her dad, really stick it to him, push his buttons. All of those options, plausible. All of those options, pretty realistic. And whichever option we land on, I'm not really sure that it matters, because no matter how you slice it, Rachel's decision in these verses, it's dysfunctional. It is dysfunctional to steal from your dad. It is dysfunctional to put your trust in false gods. It is dysfunctional to dishonor your dad, to discredit your dad. All of it is dysfunctional, the way that Rachel responds. She is treated dysfunctionally, so she responds with dysfunction. And then Jacob, I think that Jacob's a little more nuanced, right? I don't know that I would go as far as saying that when Jacob lies to his wicked father-in-law Laban, that he's necessarily doing something that's sinful. But I would go as far as saying that when Jacob lies to his wicked father-in-law Laban, it's not ideal. It's not ideal. We should never have to lie to the people that we're closest to, right? He lies to protect his family, lies because he doesn't want to start this fight, lies because he doesn't want Laban to pursue him. But what Jacob does and what Rachel do, they're equated in the original language of the Old Testament. The word for Rachel stealing the idols, it's the same word for Jacob deceiving Laban there. They're connected. When Jacob is treated dysfunctionally, he responds with dysfunction. Whether it was right or wrong, good or bad, it's dysfunctional to have to lie. That's not the way things are supposed to be. You've probably heard the phrase that hurt people hurt people. I think it applies in this passage as well, that when people are treated dysfunctionally, they treat other people dysfunctionally because of it. It's a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle that reminds us that we probably shouldn't do what dysfunctional people do. A good way to avoid dysfunction. Don't do what dysfunctional people do. I think in Genesis 31, we have sort of this perversion of the golden rule. Because the golden rule from Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, it says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It does not say, very close attention, it does not say that we should do unto others what they have done to us. That's called revenge. That's what we see in Genesis 31. Jacob, Rachel, Leah, Laban taking revenge back and forth on one another. It's not what we're supposed to do. No, we do unto others what we wish they would do to us. We treat other people the way they want to be treated. So maybe when somebody treats us dysfunctionally, we're not going to do what dysfunctional people do. Instead, we're going to do what Jesus would do. We're going to respond with grace and with favor and with mercy and with forgiveness and kindness, and we're going to love that person right in the midst of their dysfunction, just like Jesus has loved us in the midst of ours. I think that might be a better approach to dealing with dysfunction until it's dealt with permanently. Now, the next stage of the story, we see what happens when Laban catches up to Jacob. He finds out that the household gods are gone. He finds out that his kids and his grandkids are gone and the livestock's gone. And so he chases Jacob down and he catches up with him. When he catches up with him, he has all those accusations that we summarized. But then, like we said, in verses 29 through 30, we get a good look at just how dysfunctional Laban is. In verses 29 through 30 and also in verse 36 and in verse 42. I think what we're going to see is that dysfunction causes us to do things that we never thought we would do. It causes us to do things we never even thought that we would be capable of doing. Verse 29, I have the power to harm you. Laban probably never thought he was going to say that to his family. But last night, God showed up and said, don't say anything good or bad to Jacob. But then we get to the end of verse 30. But what did you do with my household gods? What'd you do? By the way, what'd you do with those household gods? I bet Laban never thought that he was going to accuse his kids of theft. I bet Laban never thought that he was going to value some statues over his own kids. I bet you Laban never thought he was going to threaten to harm his kids or chase them down or accuse them in this way. He probably never thought this was going to happen, but that is how dysfunction works. Dysfunction causes us to do things that we never thought that we would do. I also think that dysfunction, it causes us to deal with things that we never thought we would have to deal with. Jacob, he probably never thought he was going to have to deal with a father-in-law like this, right? Man, father-in-law from your nightmares, chasing him down, accusing him, threatening to harm him. Jacob is dealing with stuff that he never thought he would have to deal with. But I think that Jacob's response is pretty practical. Verse 36, Jacob was angry, and he took Laban to task. took him to task. What is my crime? He asked Laban. What sin have I committed that you hunt me down? Took Laban to task. So first of all, he defends himself with that very passionate speech where he proves his innocence. But that's not all that he does. He doesn't just defend himself. Remember, he also gives God the credit for defending him. Verse 42, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you surely would have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you. So in this section of the story, we've got Laban doing stuff he never thought he would do. And we've got Jacob dealing with stuff he never thought he was going to have to deal with. And I think that both of their interactions, both of their reactions, I think it gives us some ideas about how we might be able to apply these verses to our own lives. Because maybe we are a lot like Laban. And maybe our life is starting to look like something that we don't want it to look like. Maybe our life is so dysfunctional and so sinful that, man, we really don't like who we've become. We know that we're not the kind of person that God would have us to be. We don't even recognize ourselves anymore because we're so swallowed up in sin and dysfunction. And if that is the case, if we are like Laban, then we have to ask ourselves, man, is God truly dealing with the dysfunction in my heart? Am I allowing God to deal with the dysfunction that is going on in my life? So maybe we're like Laban, or maybe we're like Jacob and we're dealing with some stuff that we never thought we would have to deal with. Honestly, some stuff that we shouldn't have to deal with. And I think that if we're like Jacob, I think Jacob's response, I know he's kind of a morally ambiguous character, a lot of gray areas, not a lot of black and white. He does a lot wrong, sometimes gets it right. I think this is one area where Jacob, I think he gets it right. I think he actually does a good job of defending himself, but also giving God the credit for defending him. Because Jacob, he doesn't become a doormat for dysfunction. He doesn't allow Laban to walk all over him. He defends himself. That is 100% okay for us to do. When somebody is treating us dysfunctionally, it's okay to stand up and say, actually, you're wrong, and you need to stop. That's okay. Nothing wrong with that. But also Jacob trusts that justice rests in God's hands. He doesn't try to take justice into his own hands. He doesn't try to take revenge on Laban. He doesn't try to get Laban back for what Laban has done to him. No, Jacob, he leaves justice in God's hands. He knows that God is the one who's going to defend him truly and ultimately at the end of the day. So maybe what we need to do is we need to ask ourselves who we're more like. Are we more like Jacob? Or are we more like Laban? Are we more like Laban or are we more like Jacob? Are we allowing God to deal with the dysfunction in our lives? Now, the last scene in our story brings things to a sort of tenuous conclusion. In verses 45 through 55, Laban knows that he's been beaten. He knows that he has been bested by Jacob. And because he's been beaten, he needs to make sure that Jacob's not able to beat him. Because Jacob is so strong and so powerful, he wants to make sure. He wants to make sure that there is no way that Laban is going to be in danger because of Jacob's flocks and herds and armies and wealth and his power. So he makes this treaty. And this is how the treaty goes. Verse 45, Jacob took a stone and he set it up as a pillar. He said to his relatives, probably Laban's men, gather up some stones. They took some stones, they piled them in a heap. I don't know about y'all, but the pillar looks a lot neater than the heap, right? Jacob's just doing a better job. And then they ate there by the heap, and Laban called the place Yegar Sahadutha, and Jacob called it Gilead. Also, I kind of like Jacob's name better. It just rolls off the tongue a little bit nicer. Now, with Jacob and with Laban, what we see is they might be coming together, but they have never been more apart. They have never been more separate. We have two different structures, a heap and a pillar. We have two different names for these two different structures. And then what else do we have? Skipping down to verses 51 through 55. Verses 51 through 55. Laban, he gives sort of the legal terminology for this covenant or this agreement. He says, hey, here's the heap on my side. You're not going to cross over onto my side. Here's the heap on your side. I'm not going to cross over onto your side. And then he swears by the name of three different gods, the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of his father. Three different gods, like we said, covering those polytheistic bases. So he's covering his bases, swearing to these three different gods, but Jacob, he swears by the name of the one true God. Swears by the name of the one true God. So we've got two different structures, we've got two different names, two different sets of gods that have been prayed to. And what we see in Genesis 31 is that while Jacob and Laban may have come together to make this covenant, they have never been more apart. In fact, they are making a promise that they're never going to cross paths again. That's the whole reason that they have come together. And that does not feel like a great conclusion to this story, right? Just agreeing to disagree, agreeing that we're never going to interact, that doesn't feel like a very satisfying ending to this story. But that's because, I think the last scene in our story, it shows us that dysfunction is difficult to resolve. It shows us that dysfunction is difficult to resolve. In fact, I believe that probably on this side of eternity, there are very few instances or situations of dealing with dysfunction that are going to feel resolved completely and going to feel resolved entirely. We're probably not going to have that experience. But I do think that the way Jacob and Laban sort of resolve things, even though it's a little bit tense and tenuous, the way they resolve things, it's a very realistic picture of how resolving dysfunction works here and now on this side of eternity. Might not be dealt with perfectly, might not be peace for everyone all around, but it is very realistic. Because if we do all of the right things and make all of the right decisions, and we assume that our dysfunction is going to become all rainbows and roses because we did things right, we're going to be sorely disappointed. It's just not how dysfunction works. It's difficult for us to resolve. Instead, I think maybe the more realistic response would be to do what Jacob and to do what Laban did. They set some boundaries, right? Maybe somebody hurt you in the past and you've forgiven them. You don't have to be their best friend. It's okay. 100% okay. Set some boundaries. That's what Jacob and Laban do. Fun fact, that boundary that exists in this passage, it exists even today. The boundary between Israel and Aram, it's the boundary today between Israel and Syria. Still a boundary that is fought over and contested and hotly fought over, right? That it's a conflict in an area of dysfunction that has not yet gone away. Maybe that means for us, that conflict and that dysfunction, it's not going away anytime soon. We have to deal with it here and now as best as we possibly can. Maybe what we need to do is we need to make some compromises. Jacob doesn't get everything he wants, but neither does Laban. Maybe we need to realize that resolving dysfunction doesn't mean we get everything we want. Doesn't mean we get everything we want, but it does mean that we've reached a resolution. Maybe we need to make some compromises. If we come to the end of the story and it feels kind of like the story's unfinished, I think it's probably because it is. Like we've said a few different times this morning, the only way that dysfunction is truly dealt with is when we get to Jesus. It's the only way that dysfunction is truly dealt with. And in these verses that we have just read, I believe they remind us that's what Jesus does. He's the one who truly deals with our dysfunction. In fact, I think that all of the places where we've used the word dysfunction, we could instead use sin as a synonym. Sin as a synonym for dysfunction. All of the dysfunction we've seen in these verses, it's just a different kind of sin. From jealousy to greed to thievery to dishonesty and deception and unethical leadership, strife and malice and spite and idolatry, all different kinds of sins that you and I have had committed against us, but also sins that you and I have committed against others. But the very best news that we find in Genesis chapter 31 is that Jesus, He's the one who deals with our dysfunction. He's the one who deals with our sins. It's because of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus that our sin and our dysfunction has been dealt with permanently. See, the story of the gospel, it does not end the way Genesis 31 ends. The story of the gospel does not end with tension. It does not end with partial resolutions. It does not have an unsatisfying conclusion. No, the story of the gospel, it ends with Jesus bringing all people together into the family of God. And that is because it is only through Jesus that our dysfunction can be dealt with. So Jesus, this morning, we're immensely grateful for how you've dealt with us and our dysfunction. And it's our prayer this morning that we would be reminded of the truth, that it's only you who can do that. You're the one who deals with it. But in the meantime, Jesus, it's also our prayer you'd help us to do what we can. To maybe create some distance between us and the dysfunctional people in our lives, to not do what dysfunctional people do, not to take revenge, but to follow the golden rule, not to let dysfunction lead us down a road that we never wanted to go down, but to remember that dysfunction, it's really difficult to resolve, even impossible to resolve without your intervention. So Jesus, we're thankful that you did intervene. We're thankful for your life and your death and your resurrection, where you prove that you have dealt with our sin and our dysfunction once and for all. And Jesus, because of it, we love you and we praise you. And it's in your name. And everybody said, amen.
Thank you so much for checking us out online today. We hope it was a blessing and an encouragement to your life.
And if you would like to give today, there are two ways you can do so. You can text your amount to 84321, or you can go to giving.nlspringfield.com.
Also, if you are new here, we have Party with the Pastors the first week of each month. We would love to see you there.
We get to know you better, and you get to know us a little better too. And also, we have services every Sunday at 8, 9:30, and 11, and we'd love to see you in person.
We will see you next week.